The technological achievements of our ancient ancestors were outstanding, and they often don't get enough credit for them. There were things our ancestors could do with bricks and stones in the distant past that we'd struggle to replicate today. So much so that we can't help but wonder if some of the technology of the distant past has been lost. We're not alone in wondering about that. Many people feel the same way, and you might join them after watching this video. You have to go a long way off the beaten track to find the ancient and mysterious site of Napahuaca in Peru. Even its name gives it an air of intrigue. It translates into English as the Temple of the Ancients. The purpose of the structure is unclear, but it's believed to be a megalithic throne, somehow carved with impeccable precision from one single lump of bluestone. Some historians and archaeologists have noted that it looks a little like the Andean cross, which is an important symbol in the context of Inca cosmology. The most mysterious part of the structure is found at its rear, where a false door has been carved into the rock. How the door was carved so cleanly and precisely into the stone is unknown. And to make things even more mysterious, the slopes of the structure are at almost exactly the same angle as the slopes of the Great Pyramid of Giza, accurate to within half a degree. The fact that the doorway doesn't lead anywhere has led to legends that it's a portal to another dimension. But we're sure that's just fanciful thinking. When Virginia Maxey and Wallace Lane wandered into the dry bed of Owens Lake, close to the Koso Mountains in California in 1961, all they really wanted to find were a few geodes to sell in their gift shop. Instead, they found a conundrum of an artifact that's confounded archaeologists and historians ever since. It's known as the Koso artifact, and it consists of a 1920 spark plug inside an iron oxide shell. There's no mystery about where the spark plug came from. It's one of the thousands that were manufactured during the 1920s by a company called Champion. The issue is the iron shell that surrounds it, which is 500,000 years old. The shell formed around the spark plug, and so logic tells us that the spark plug must have been inside it for 500,000 years. You don't need us to tell you that's impossible. Some scientists say that the iron oxide shell grew faster than normal because of porous minerals interacting with the metal spark plug, but the evidence of that is shaky at best. It probably isn't the smoking gun evidence of time travel that some people claim it is, but it's definitely a puzzling anomaly. Our questions about ancient technology aren't limited to Earth. Some of them are literally out of this world. In 2016, a 3-year study into what's been dubbed the Keyhole structure on the surface of Mars was concluded by George Haas and his teammate at the Cydonia Institute. They determined that the perfect symmetry of the distinct dome and wedge shape makes it unlikely to have been created by natural erosion. That means that it would have to be artificial, which is a seemingly impossible conclusion to draw about anything on the surface of Mars. It also appears to bear more than a passing resemblance to the kind of keyhole tomb that you'll find in Kofun, Japan. Such structures were built during the early 5th century. We're not, for a moment, suggesting that there were humans or aliens making regular trips between Japan and Mars back then, but it's odd that the same design appears in both places. Plenty of scientists dispute the Cydonia Institute's findings, but the fact remains that the geometric perfection of the shape isn't consistent with anything we've come to expect from nature. Our next scientific puzzle hides in plain sight in Egypt. All over the country's ancient monuments, you'll find perfectly drilled holes. We tend to overlook them because drilling perfect holes isn't exactly difficult today, but it ought to have been impossible for people living 2,000 years ago. At the site of Abu Ghorab in Abu Sir, you'll find hundreds of examples of the holes. many of which have been drilled through several inches of solid granite. To repeat such an operation today, we'd need a hydraulic drill, and even then, we'd have to use a diamond tip to ensure the tool could penetrate the rock. That wasn't an option for these ancient Egyptian workers, and in truth, we have no idea what kind of tools they might have used for the task. They certainly didn't leave any tool marks on the sides of the holes, which are almost impossibly smooth. Historians tell us that the only tools used in the making of these structures were stone and wooden tools and copper saws. None of them would have been up to the task of making these holes, and so we have to ask ourselves how it was done. Sadly, scientists don't have an answer. You'd have to fly high into the sky above the Turgai region of Kazakhstan if you wanted to see our next mystery with your own eyes. It's a series of enormous geometric shapes etched into the desert, comparable to the famous Nazca lines in Peru, and perhaps even surpassing them in terms of both size and complexity. Archaeologist Dimitri Day was the first to notice the shapes using Google Earth. When seen from ground level, the shapes are an indistinguishable collection of earthen mounds. But from an aerial vantage point, they become crosses, circles, squares, and lines. They vary in size between 200 and 1,400 feet and are spread across an area of almost 400 square miles. Archaeologists believe that they were made around 8,000 years ago. The amount of work that would be involved in creating these shapes would have been enormous, as would the level of communication and coordination required to ensure they made coherent shapes. How anyone was able to do this when they couldn't see the full picture from above is unexplained. Perhaps more important is the question of why anyone would do this when they'd have no way of seeing or appreciating the finished product. Human-powered flight is an invention of the 20th century, or at least that's what we've always been taught to believe. It appears that the truth might be far harder to swallow. Welcome to the concept of Vimanas, ancient Indian chariots that allegedly rose into the sky, spewing fire and water as they went. It would be easy to write them off as an ancient hoax if references to them didn't appear in so many texts written independently of each other. They're mentioned by name in both Hindi and Sanskrit texts that date back 3,500 years. The most detailed description of them comes from the Veda, which says the interior of the flying vessels contained 12 pillars, a wheel, a control panel, and 300 articulated pivot points. Another text, known as the Ramayana, explains that ownership of Vimanas was limited to the ruling class, which is corroborated by the Mahabharata texts. There's no direct evidence that one single Vimana ever existed, but why did so many ancient writers speak of them like they'd seen them with their own eyes? Everybody knows what a Swiss Army knife is, but perhaps they shouldn't. It's the world's most famous multi-tool, and while it may or may not once have been standard issue in the Swiss Army, the Swiss didn't invent it. That honor goes, like so many important inventions, to the ancient Romans. The Roman answer to the Swiss Army knife was discovered at an undisclosed archaeological site somewhere on the Mediterranean coast in 2019. The archaeologists responsible for the discovery say that it was made during the early 3rd century and features a knife, a fork, a spoon, a spatula, and a toothpick. Based on that, it was probably more likely to be used by soldiers preparing and eating meals than it was for attacking enemies, although the knife would obviously be handy in that regard. The fact that the knife is made of silver rather than a cheaper metal suggests that it belonged to a high-ranking officer. As only one such object has ever been found, we don't know if it was a commonplace item or whether this is a unique object, possibly invented by the very same person who used it. If that were the case, they were around 1,500 years ahead of their time. Our Our next artifact is so wrapped up in myth and legend that we almost don't know where to start with its origin story. This is the Pythagoras Cup, which is sometimes also known as the Tantalus Cup. The most commonly told story about it is that it was invented by the legendary genius Pythagoras of Samos as a way of preventing his workers from getting drunk on the job. The drinking vessel works just the same as any other, so long as it's filled up to the correct point, but anything beyond that results in the entire contents being expelled out of the bottom of the cup, and probably all over the person holding it. Cleverly, the cup contains a U-shaped pipe hidden at its center. As the cup fills with liquid, pressure builds up inside the pipe until it can take no more and dumps everything out of the base. As this would probably have been quite funny to watch, there's every chance that it was created as a practical joke rather than a way of keeping workers relatively sober. It might have had nothing to do with Pythagoras at all, but the 2,600-year-old philosopher's name is attached to it anyway. We've sung the praises of the ancient Romans quite a few times in this video already, and now we're going to do it again. Take a good look at the Lycurgus Cup. Is it green or is it red? Actually, it's both. The color you see depends on what angle you look at it from, and what direction the light that hits it comes from. The stunning visual effect is down to the fact that microscopic particles of gold and silver were added during the glass-making stage. The particles are only 50 nanometers in diameter, and so we can say that the Romans invented nanotechnology. As each particle is 1,000 times smaller than the average grain of salt, we have no idea how the Roman genius responsible for the invention of this cup was able to work with them. They certainly didn't have a microscope for assistance 1,600 years ago. The chances of the particles getting into the mix by accident are non-existent. So whoever made this beautiful decorative glass knew exactly what they were doing. They might have been the only person in the Roman Empire who did, though. Nothing like this has ever been found anywhere else within former Roman territories. Human beings first manufactured aluminum 2 centuries ago. We want you to bear that in mind as we examine our next incredible artifact. It was found in Romania in 1973, but as Romania was a communist and secretive country back then, it wasn't known of by the wider scientific community until much more recently. The artifact, which appears to have been shaped and engineered by human hands, is a total anomaly. It's made of aluminum, but is also 250,000 years old. Based on its shape and design, it looks like it might once have been part of an axe. There was nobody around to make axes 250,000 years ago, and even if there had been, they wouldn't have been able to use this material to make it. The findings of the Romanian lab were so surprising that the object was taken to another lab in Lausanne, Switzerland for confirmation. The Swiss scientists got the same results as their Romanian counterparts. Unsurprisingly, conspiracy theorists claim that the artifact is a piece of an alien spacecraft left behind after a visit to Earth in the distant past. Perhaps they're right, though. It's not as if scientists have a better explanation. Is the Iron Pillar of Delhi an example of steelwork that was over 1,000 years ahead of its time, or a happy accident? Scientists have never been able to agree about the answer to that question, and it's possible that they never will. What can be said with certainty is that the pillar, which is sometimes also known as the Ashoki Pillar, has stood proudly and resolutely rust-free in Delhi, India for 1,500 years. The entire surface of the 22-foot-tall monument is coated in an incredibly thin layer of mesowite, which prevents the iron beneath it from exposure to oxygen, which would result in the formation of rust. Quite how such a technically complex task could be achieved by the primitive coal furnaces of 1,500 years ago is unknown. Scientists think that it might have been a freak event caused by the iron mixing with slag, lime, and damp air while it cooled, as the people who made it would have had no idea that the rust-proof coating even existed. they'd have viewed it as a miracle. It took several centuries for anyone to come up with a deliberate form of rust-proofing. So either the Indians kept their secrets, or they never intended to rust-proof the pillar at all. The Shugborough inscription is only 10 letters long. That doesn't leave much room for it to create an enduring mystery that's lasted for several centuries, but it's managed to do it anyway. The inscription is carved into the Shepherd's Monument in Shugborough Hall, England. The monument itself is an interesting artifact. It's a sculpture that features a relief based on a painting by Poussin. Peter Shee is the sculptor who created it in 1763, using Poussin's The Shepherds of Arcadia as a reference guide. But for reasons best known to himself, he added the letters O, U, O, S, V, A, V, and V beneath it. Slightly below that string of characters are the letters D and M. They're not Roman numerals, and they don't correspond to any known ancient code. Most academics believe that the text is an encoded message from Shee, but nobody's been able to work out what it says. Even the great Charles Dickens once applied his mind to the question, and he couldn't come up with a solution. Perhaps Peter was just a prankster, in which case we're sure he'd be happy to know that people are still puzzled by the code he invented almost 250 years after he passed away. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!